Hello, and welcome to our interactive deep dive on the potential of digitization for small businesses. I'm Joyce Klein. I direct the Aspen Institute's Business Ownership Initiative, and I'll be your moderator for today's conversation. The Business Ownership Initiative is one of two programs at the Aspen Institute that work to expand and support small businesses. The Business Ownership Initiative focuses largely in the United States, and we work to expand economic opportunity through business ownership. And then my colleagues at the Aspen Network for Development Entrepreneurs, or ANDE, organize and support a global network of organizations that are working to propel entrepreneurship in developing economies. And their work includes providing resources to their members to support digitization of the small business sector, which is what we'll be talking about today. Both of our programs are actually part of the Global Inclusive Growth Partnership between the Aspen Institute and the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth. So if you're joining our conversation today, it's probably because you share our interest in small businesses. Small firms are critical to employment in virtually every nation, and that's particularly true in emerging economies. And I think all of us are aware of the way that digitization is transforming commerce across the globe. And of course, the COVID pandemic only accelerated that trend. And I think we care about technology and digitization because they have the potential to increase the productivity of small firms. They have the potential to help small firms access new markets. But it's also the case that small firms face greater barriers than large firms do in using technology, which can make it challenging for them to compete in an increasingly digital economy. So in our deep dive today, we're going to dive deeper into some of the themes that were surfaced in this morning's conversations. We're going to talk about the role of technology, the role that it can play in driving inclusion. We'll talk more about how to advance financial inclusion globally, but we're going to have that conversation with a specific lens and focus on the implications of these topics for small firms. And for our conversation today, I'm going to be joined by four individuals who are deeply engaged in addressing this conversation in places across the globe. We're also going to have this conversation with a specific focus on the businesses and the business owners who have the greatest challenges in accessing and using technology and other critical resources. So in particular, we're going to focus on the very smallest firms. We're going to focus on firms owned by women, firms owned by people of color, racial and ethnic minorities and indigenous people, folks living in more rural communities as well. And a quick note in terms of some of the language you'll hear today, we may use the acronyms SMBs or SMEs as shorthand. And by that, we mean small and medium-sized enterprises or small and medium-sized businesses. So my guests for today's conversation are a great team. We have Juan Navarrete from Fundación Capital. We have Barbara Magnoni from Noawi Solutions, Chris Locke with Caribou Digital, and Tim Ogden with the Financial Access Initiative at NYU Wagner. I'm not going to do detailed introductions for all of them. You can find their bios on the speaker page, and we will share at various times links to their bios in the chat so that you can access more information about the great work that they're all doing. I will note that Fundación Capital is a member of the Aspen Network of Development Entrepreneurs, and that Fundación Capital, Caribou Digital, and the Financial Access Initiative at NYU are all grantees of the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth. So finally, just a few words about how this deep dive session is going to go. We're going to have three parts. First, two of our speakers, Juan and Tim, will engage in a brief sort of counterpoint on the positive and negatives of digitization for small firms. And that conversation will really get out the critical issues that organizations who are working to support small businesses are really focused on when they work on this issue of digitization. Then Chris and Barbara will join Juan and me in a moderated discussion for about 20 minutes. And then I'll start to feed into that conversation the questions that come in via the chat. And please feel free to share questions at any time in the chat. We'll be scanning those. We do have at least 30 or 40 folks with us, and hopefully more will join us. So we may not get to all your questions. We will try to look for those that are popping up more than once. So if you like a question that someone's posed and want to see it asked to the group, feel free to sort of upvote it or second that in the chat, and we will keep track of that. So with that, let me turn it over for Tim and Juan for our point counterpoint this morning.
Hi, Tim. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you.
Yes, I would like to tell you a little bit about our Latin American Digital project funded by the Center for Inclusive Growth. It's given us very, very interesting lessons because when we started the project, the pandemic had actually just begun. And we realized that we needed to act fast and at least provide shortcuts for businesses to access liquidity and information on aspects such as financial health and COVID-related precautions. And to this end, we rolled out a bot-type digital coaching tool in Mexico, Colombia, and Peru among micro and small businesses with very positive and very interesting results in terms of the time and transaction costs saved by users in accessing subsidies from government COVID programs. So that was something that we did very, very fast because the pandemic had just erupted. And it sort of underlined the importance that historically as an organization, we digital tools. So I'd like to know what you think of that.
So what I hear a lot when people talk about digitization is the upside, how much time and money it can save. And, I'm not disputing that that's true. It does. But so much of that conversation is about the cost of each additional transaction, which is very low when it comes to technology. You can do more and more without spending a lot of more money. What I don't hear people talking enough about is the cost of digitization in the first place. So as you said, Fundación Capital was able to roll this out quickly, but that's because Fundación Capital had been investing a substantial amount in technological tools for a long time. And for the people who take up these technologies, it means they have to have the physical infrastructure. And we're talking about a population that often is at the margins of poverty, even below poverty level. The investment in infrastructure, the digital infrastructure to be able to be digital, rarely gets brought up in some of these conversations. And I'm especially worried that these conversations don't take into account the ongoing costs of maintaining a technological infrastructure, participating in a digital economy, particularly where it comes to security. These days we hear every day about some other organization that has been hacked, has been held for ransom. And we're pushing a bunch of people who don't have the knowledge and don't have the expertise, much less the ability to pay to secure themselves.
Yes, I do agree with you, Tim. But I guess as far as the cost of devices and connectivity constraints, for instance, I guess that both you and myself can about the rapid pace of adoption of smartphones and data plans by the bottom of the pyramid. When Fundación Capital started, about 12 our tools were meant to work in tablets and offline. And today, our designs are mostly for lower-end smartphones populations actually have access. So I guess it's a trend that is not going to stop. And as far as concerned, you're also right. That is actually a big challenge that I think we all have to tackle. I think that the tools to securely navigate digital environments are needed not only by vulnerable SMEs, but by other segments as well, such or senior citizens. So I think this is something that concerns us all, and it's a challenge that I guess we just have to tackle and to have refined and better tools to securely navigate digital ecosystems. In the case of SMEs, I think we have collected wonderful stories. We recently recorded an interview, for example, here in Mexico with a female business owner who was extremely that had translated in lower levels of cash in the shop, and who also had the opportunity to cross-sell through digital payments. This lady had actually suffered from a robbery the month before she actually started using the POS device. And then, among other benefits, there is, of course, the aspect of access to finance. There is the possibility of a digital footprint possible for MSMEs to access productive credit. We have seen a very wide variety of solutions from different stakeholders like fintech, consumer goods companies that have a better understanding of MSMEs through their digital footprint to offer them productive credit. So I think this is very positive as well.
And one of these advantages is this visibility that you talk about. That is one of the reasons it's been very hard to serve this segment, is because it's hard to know who's there, to identify them, understand who can reasonably borrow. But a lot of the conversation too about visibility presumes that someone wants to do something, that there are banks out there that want to serve this segment. And you're based in Mexico, Juan. You know that the large majority of the challenge in Mexico isn't so much that no one knows these customers are there, but the traditional banks have for decades declined to serve this segment. So just because the data is there doesn't necessarily mean that some other organization is going to want to come along and serve these people. And I think we have to take into account that some of the people who do want access to this data are not people who want to see these firms prosper, but because they see a new market for their predatory products. And if you use some of that data in the wrong ways, you can convince people, fool people into taking products that are not good for them, that are good for the provider, but not good for the firm. And then that adds a whole other layer of burden onto the owners of these firms. We know that there is a managerial skill and experience gap for these firms, that they need help understanding sort of how to get better at managing their firms. And digitization then adds a whole other skill category to them, that they need to be able to understand the difference between what is a net positive credit offer and what does a predatory loan look like? How do I know the scammers from the real providers? How do I know that I'm not getting myself in too deep or borrowing too much? So I worry about adding yet another burden onto these small businesses.
That's true. I think it's a burden. And yes, you do indeed have to invest time and effort to be digitally functional and to securely navigate digital ecosystems. But it's about how much effort MSMEs need to do. As far as we're concerned, we have focused on the most practical aspects in terms of the contents in our capacity building tools. And once we manage to build a skill or change a behavior, MSMEs actually save a lot of time in their management tasks and can become more productive. And as far as predatory credit, also true. I mean, in Mexico, there is very expensive credit, but entrepreneurs need to be empowered with information and capacities to be able to make the smartest decisions when accessing finance and to be aware of their rights as well. And what we have experienced with our digital management tools is that once there is this effort invested, as you know, time is among the scarce resources that business owners have. And in our program, we have been offering, for example, inventory management tools meant to save time and untap the business potential of the owners because they have more free time to make a business plan and think about the future. Observed in the journey of digitization of some SMEs, entrepreneurs that have actually accessed digital marketplaces that permit them to expand their markets and increasingly operate with digital payments, and which have permitted as well, for example, to offer new services such as home deliveries, which are very relevant for COVID times. So in the overall, yes, you have to make an effort. There are a lot, but once you do it, you can see the gains relatively fast.
So you mentioned home delivery there, Juan, as a sort of a new service and ability to reach new customers. And again, I think that can be pretty exciting. But it also, when you think about home delivery, digitization also enables the big players to compete more easily with the small players, to use their scale economies. And even if they're businesses that are in the sort of the platform business model, these small businesses are really far more at the mercy of those platforms if they digitize than to anybody they would have done business with before. I think about an organization like Amazon or Mercado Libre in Brazil. These platforms really are about trying to make the small businesses on them interchangeable. They're in it to serve the customer, not to serve the small business. And for them, they want to bring as many people as possible and have them compete with each other for the benefit of the customer. So, maybe the business can reach more customers, but also there are thousands of more businesses competing for those customers. That introduces a level of competition for those small firms that now they're having to sort of keep up with the pace of technology. It's not just one investment. I am fairly digital, but I had a hard time using my phone this week because Google updated Android and they moved all the buttons on my phone. I think about the burden on these firms of keeping up with all of the changes that are being driven in technology. Can they keep up? And for those that can't, are they left even further behind? Are we increasing a digital divide for some of those firms?
Yes, I think that we all suffer from the problems of the very, not only in terms of competition, as you rightly mentioned, especially for MSMEs. A couple of weeks ago, we were suffering from the WhatsApp and Instagram problems and Facebook problems globally. And that is a challenge that we all have to face. But at the same time, I have to say that there are not only these large platforms that you mentioned. We have seen very interesting projects and endeavors with platforms that are able to differentiate their services to cater to specific needs, for example, or for specific niches. And even though some of these projects are only in a startup mode at the moment, I think that interesting prospect into the future in terms of further differentiations and new platforms. And yes, I mean, there is also the challenge of the digital divide. And that's actually why we need to put together comprehensive strategies and tools to help entrepreneurs adoption journeys. Value chains are increasingly digital, and non-digital entrepreneurs are likely to be excluded from inclusive growth ecosystems. So the digital divide is already there. And if we don't act fast, the gap will be wider and wider, and crucial segments of our economies will be left behind. So I think all of the points that you rightly point out are absolutely true. Point five, we need to have a comprehensive agenda of how best possible digital navigators in this complex ecosystem.
Well, thank you, Juan. For our audience, that was a little bit of a caricature, but we wanted to put a lot of issues out on the table to set up this next conversation that Juan is going to be part of, delving into more of the details of how we reach these segments, how we protect them from risks and enable them to take advantage of opportunities without deepening or widening the digital divide. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Joyce.
Terrific. So thanks again to Tim and Juan for really setting the stage and getting a lot of issues out there on the table. And welcome, Barbara and Chris. Great to have you join the conversation to bring in your perspectives and your take on these issues. First, to jump right in, I'd love to get, that was a lot, Barbara and Chris, but I could see you, we were in the green room and you're nodding your head. So love to get your takes on some of these. I'm going to start with Barbara. Always Solutions works with Indigenous people in Mexico to bridge the digital divide. Would love to hear, like, what are the 1 or 2 points that either Chris or Tim made that you want to just make sure, you can reinforce and share a little bit about how they connect to the work that you're doing.
Yeah, thank you, Joyce. I would love to speak to that. And just to kind of step back for a second, what we do is we have a digital marketplace that is like a tech solution, but we use a phygital strategy to onboard people. So we have people who either visit or call or use technology to communicate with small businesses to get them onboarded and then to promote utilization. And through that, we collect a lot of data and a lot of sort of understanding of our customers. And one thing we found and what really resonated to me was sort of Tim's point about, in the first place, like what comes before adoption, and it is the telephone, right? It's having the equipment, and it's having the connectivity. And there's sort of another step that we also take into account, which I'll explain, but Our customers in general, about 5% of the people we approach will not have a smartphone or connectivity at all. That doesn't include the people who tell us, oh, I don't have data on my phone right now, which is a much larger number. And that's a problem that we find all the time, particularly the more informal you go. The second step that we've considered in our sort of model for digital adoption is actually having an email account. In Mexico, and this is different in different regions, in Mexico, without an email account that's functional, you can't verify your identity for most fintech solutions. And 25% of the people we approach either don't have email or more likely don't remember. So we have to kind of regenerate and start them from scratch. So that's about 30% of people that we approach that don't even get to the point of being ready to adopt a new technology. And then from there, we have, 46% that are unbanked, and of course, the challenges that go with that. So this idea of like the cost of adoption being like pre-fintech, I think it's one that resonates really well. Once you're in the fintech space, you do find very cost accessible products, as one mentioned, that may be more attractive than, traditional bank products, and often are. I want to address a couple more points that they made. One is on the security. We agree, and Mexico is not a safe place to walk around with bills, that, security and having cash taken care of is a huge issue. Nonetheless, people are very aware of issues of data security, of issues of, money sort of disappearing. And there's also this kind of trust piece that wasn't mentioned earlier that I think is really important, right? I'm giving a company that I've never heard about my money, even if it's $30, but it's my money. And I don't know whether either I will push the wrong button and make it disappear, or they will do something to make it disappear. And so that is also kind of in the security space, but I relate it much more to trust and confidence, something that comes up. I have one more comment I think that's important and kind of touches on a few of the things, which is consumer protection, as Tim mentioned, is really important, but I think also appropriateness of product, which falls into consumer protection, is very important. Today, we have a very fragmented offer of fintech services that doesn't really think of the user. They talk about UX, but they talk about UX and user experience from the sort of UX tech journey. They don't really talk about it as the business experience and the business journey. And there are very few organizations that are thinking about taking a business from A to B and what you need to get there. And so you have these kind of fragmented products, many of which are excellent. And I think this idea of helping you manage your money, control, separate your accounts, there's a lot of benefits that you can get, but there are also a lot of gaps in that fragmentation that need to be filled. And for me, the one that worries me the most, particularly post-pandemic, as we think about a recovery, is the gap in really loan size. Yeah, you can lend $100 to pretty much anybody today through a telephone, but how many businesses actually need $100 in Mexico? You can buy like a case of Coca-Cola. That's not going to change your life. Businesses need much bigger investments, and neither banks nor fintechs are in that place yet and have figured out how to make like larger investments that are necessary. So I'll stop there, and we can keep going.
Terrific. So I'm gonna turn it to Chris now. Chris, first, thanks. Congratulations on the announcement of Strive Community. So folks may have a sense of what it is from hearing the announcement, but just to be clear, it's a global project, and you're really working to leverage digital channels to help SMEs improve their businesses. So love to hear your take. It sounds like you're probably on the positive side, but what's the balance for you in terms of the issues that Tim raised, the cons, and the issues that Juan raised?
Yeah, no, I mean, positive, but also being very open to helping small businesses understand what the opportunities and the risks are, and how they make sure that they can maximize those opportunities while mitigating those risks. And I think the fact that trust, and indeed in the chat as well, issues around security and issues around understanding how you keep transactions safe in a digital environment have come up is because it's so fundamental. We see a lot of quite ad hoc ways in which people try to establish trust in digital transactions. Where there is a globally leading brand or a globally leading platform that they are aware of, a bank or whoever, then there is implicit trust there. But often what SMEs are doing is starting to explore new digital marketplaces and you know, having people discover their services for the first time in platforms where all you have to go off is sometimes someone's, you know, avatar and their name and their profile on a system. So it gets really, really difficult to know how to understand what trust means in those platforms. And we see people kind of in very local transactions moving down the stack to try and establish trust. So people might find customers on a broad platform like Facebook and then move to Instagram, WhatsApp, eventually phones, and then actually move down into face-to-face communication to then try and kind of re-establish trust. And I think picking up on what Barbara says, that points to how we need to consider both, you know, how you build trust into the interface and into the experience on the digital platforms that we offer to SMEs, but also more importantly, how we can make sure we upskill those SMEs within the platforms themselves. So, you know, there are a lot of very good digital literacy programs out there for individuals and for SMEs, and there's a lot of good resources online. But often you need to kind of understand those almost at the moment of use. So one of the things we're really focusing on with Strive is how do we bring that upskilling, how do we bring that information and that practical skills development to SMEs as they're starting to explore these platforms within the platform themselves. So we're trying to actually inject a lot of this kind of micro skilling and micro content within the platforms that they're starting to use and they're starting to experiment with, so that they can explore within those digital platforms how they can build trust and how they can build you know, a new useful avenue for their businesses.
Chris, I think that's a really great point. And I think it's, you know, one of the lessons we've learned as we talk about things like financial inclusion or financial capability or financial health, and probably the same for digital, is that just teaching people information without embedding it or deeply connecting it to the product or the service, it doesn't really work nearly as effectively as sort of embedding it or, you know, completely connecting it to the product or the service that you're trying to get folks to use. So one of the things I wanted to explore a little bit is this issue of trust building, which is one that I know comes up so deeply in this work. And I think one of the things that I know that organizations like yours have learned in this question of trust building is that it's not just about technology. It's about this combination of technology and touch is often the way you articulate that. And that becomes a piece. I don't think any of your organizations are technology only. So would love to hear your how you think about that and approach that in your work. And Barbara, I'm going to start with you. I'll come to everyone because I know you all do this. But this is a key piece to how I think Noavi operates. So would love to have you talk about that.
Yeah, thank you. It's something we're incredibly proud of because we actually have a dual mission. Financial inclusion is one of our missions, but labor inclusion is the second. And in Mexico, women over 35 are much more likely to either be unemployed, underemployed, or in the informal sector because many formal employment opportunities are just closed to them, especially women and you know, without higher education. So we actually hire those women to be our promoters or our Noawis, what we call them. And what is wonderful about that is that if you can teach, and this is sort of how they talk about it, you know, if I could learn, then you can learn. If I can learn to digitally adopt something, if I can learn about this technology, if I can start using my phone as a tool, then of course you can learn it as well. And it gives a lot more confidence in sort of that ability. The second thing it does is, you know, women from the communities who are a little bit older, they speak the same language. They're, you know, trusted in the community. Their faces are recognized. There are people who, you know, make you feel comfortable. And, you know, one of the hardest things, if you've ever done sales, is that first 5-second introduction. Like, hi, I'm here to sell you blah, 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 and the door shuts, right? Nobody shuts the door on an older woman in your community. That's rude. You just don't do it. And so you let them talk. And once they're talking and once they get that conversation going, then you have a dialogue and you can kind of take it from there and move on. And one of the things that we're very proud of, even though we don't specifically target women in our digital adoption strategy, one thing that we're very proud of is that by using this mechanism, we are able to have, for most of the products that we market, 70% of our customers are women, versus 30% men. We have 50-50 in one other product. And, I think that really speaks to this strategy that we use, that we're able to kind of onboard women a lot more. We've had fintechs come to us and tell us they have 10%, 20% adoption of women. So incredibly low compared to what we think about, in the microfinance world, for example, where you have a primarily female client base. In digital technology, it's a primarily male client base. So we're really proud of the fact that by using these women as our promoters, we're able to kind of onboard women more effectively.
Great. Juan, can you talk a little bit about how this plays out in your work, which I know it does?
Yes, we have always mixed the touch and the tech. Actually, we have within our digital project. And yes, I mean, digitization is just not going to happen automatically. There is always, specifically for these segments, the ingredient of the touch. And the question there is how much touch and how much tech, if you really want to have a model that is cost effective when you want to reach scale. For Fundación Capital, when we first started, we were doing projects dealing with, and we made a lot of experiments with digital tools that would substitute the traditional class model. But we always found that there was also a level of touch, and digital was never going to be the full substitute of the process. So we have experienced that over and over with different devices, with different channels. It's different today than it was 12 years ago, but there is always the... And I think that the big challenge is really finding the right mix of both if you want to grow and if you want to achieve scale. So in the end, I think it's a matter of customized services that are as personalized as possible through the touch, but being smartly.
Chris, what would you add here?
So I think, people have a mistaken assumption that when you digitize economies and when you digitize transactions, everything moves into the ether, when actually that hasn't been the case. I mean, most people's experience of COVID has been fleets of drivers expanding their businesses, moving stuff around. And I think this is almost more true in emerging markets, where even when we talk about successes, as was previously spoken about on one of the earlier sessions of something like M-Pesa in Kenya, actually that's successful because of 40-odd thousand cash in, cash out agents. And actually digital in emerging markets for low-income customers has always been a transaction that sat across very physical human interactions. And I think that only continues as we look at the way SMEs digitize their business in lots of ways. So I think tech and touch isn't something that happens in this world just to reinforce trust or to make a transaction something that people have faith in. It's actually fundamental to the ways in which digital intertwines with the physical world and the way that people run transactions in a more physical space. And I think that's always fundamentally been there in the way that emerging market digital economies have grown. They've not grown through through advertising, allowing you to get revenue from people's attention, which is the way digital economies have expanded in Silicon Valley and in more developed economies. Digital economies in emerging markets, and China is actually a good example of this, have been built on transactions. And those transactions have been built largely on the back of aggregated transactions through small businesses and platforms that can, aggregate work and labor, etc. So I think that tech and touch is far more fundamental to understanding how digital economies work for low-income users in emerging markets than necessarily it has been in more developed economies.
Chris, I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit, and this is starting to reflect a question that I think that's something that's coming through in the chat, but what needs to be done to make sure that products that are developed for the customers that we're talking about today really understand both, sort of who they are, what they need, how they behave, and what their challenges are? And is this something that fintechs are actually investing in, or do they understand these customers?
So the latter is a broader question. But I think, yeah, we are, when we look at transactions and we look at the platforms that SME are using, many of them are primarily regional or local. We talk a lot about GAFA, we talk about Google and Facebook, which understandably, as their attention-based platforms, have had huge global reach. But when we look at transaction platforms, often they are very local because they reflect the nature of those local markets. And I think it is actually sometimes quite difficult to try and take a regional model, whether it's, some of the super platforms in Indonesia or Flipkart in India or Jumia in Africa, and actually make it scale across multiple regions, because the nature of the way people transact, the nature of the type of transactions that take place, often are very, very specific to a particular community or a particular country. So I think transactional economies really shape from the bottom up, from country to region, rather than necessarily from the top down. So I think we see products that are successful being built by entrepreneurs within those markets and by people who understand the way that those markets work and see the opportunity. And I think in particular, we've really seen this in sub-Saharan Africa in the last few years, where we're seeing an absolute boom of VC investment and indeed mergers and acquisitions. We're actually seeing in the last year, more money was created through exits of fintechs in Africa than was created through VC inputs. So we're starting to really see a fair amount of activity through mergers and acquisitions that's allowing some of those platforms that have come up serving local needs, built by people that understand what those local needs are, so that they can scale and become bigger. But it feels far more like a kind of a bottom-up, down one.
Mm-hmm. Barbara, I wonder if you can speak to that, because my sense is you're someone who spent a lot of time deeply understanding who the businesses are that you want to reach, and talk about how that plays into the design of what you've done. Anything else you want to add to this conversation as well?
Sure. Yeah, I think for us, I mean, the biggest kind of learning recently has been this kind of impact of the pandemic on all of this, because we actually see, this kind of push toward digitalization, or this kind of accelerated digitalization as a result, but it's partial. So what I mean by that is the sort of biggest challenge for people was marketing when the pandemic hit, because of lockdowns. People just couldn't get their products out through their traditional channels. And so they started using these either delivery services or other kind of gig platforms, or Facebook Marketplace, which I use every day now. I don't know why, but it's become kind of a big thing. And a lot of our customers kind of adopted these. And to some extent, it's hurting those grassroots solutions that Chris was referring to in our market. And the reason for that is that you sort of go back to the trust thing. People know the brand Facebook. They know the brand, in Mexico, it might be Rappi, the delivery service, or Uber Eats, or whatever, Uber, and those brands might be kind of a nice first step toward digital adoption, because it's a known brand. You kind of feel like everybody's on it. It helps you get your commercial platform going. But then when it's time to go into a more niche product that might be a digital wallet or a local lending app or something like that, and it's not Facebook and it's not Uber and it's not a brand, they might actually have a little bit more resistance, because they're used to adopting now the brand name. So we've sort of seen that recently, which has been kind of a weird outcome.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Juan, question for you. How big a problem is lack of basic internet access still, or is the problem more about people sort of knowing what to do once they have access? There's been a lot of talk. I should note that some of the earlier sessions today talked a lot, particularly in the US, about lack of broadband and what that means in rural areas and how that creates issues for small businesses. Would love to hear your perspective on that from the places you work. I think you're on mute.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Once you have access, there is a lot to do in terms of coaching you to navigate the ecosystem. To provide you, firstly, I think, with information. It's very important to know the features of the products that you are going to access in the digital space, and also your rights, what to do if there is trouble, and what you are entitled to as an individual towards a company. That is very important. An informational layer, also a basic capacity layer, able to have the basic digital skills to navigate and to use digital tools. And thirdly, perhaps more in-depth knowledge, for example, to be a better manager of your business, to make sense. I think that in that order, because what comes first when you have access to the digital world is having these basic skills to navigate and being able to securely navigate to face all the risks that are associated with the digital space. We have done a lot of work in terms of coaching tools, digital coaching tools, WhatsApp-based, that have two-way interactions and that try to provide very basic information to be able to give you this sense of trust and this sense that you are navigating safely. I think this is absolutely important beyond deep capacity building and deep managerial knowledge. This may come first in our opinion. But then, of course, there is also a lot to do in terms of connectivity infrastructure. I mean, there are many places in Mexico that still lack this basic connectivity infrastructure, and it's yet a problem to solve. I mean, the pace of connections in rural areas, I think, is going relatively. I wouldn't necessarily say very fast, but there is. But we still need to work on those aspects, and for this aspect of further connectivity, we need to work in public-private partnerships to actually accelerate the pace if we don't want to leave behind crucial segments of our economies. One of our worries is that if we don't work on both aspects, the digital gap is going to grow wider and wider.
Mm-hmm. So, Juan, one of the points you mentioned, which I know is something we wanted to touch on today, is, so you spoke to the access question, but there's really the question about once someone gets access, how do you really maintain engagement, which is in some cases really fundamental to sort of the business models, particularly if you're a transaction-based business, I would think. Mm-hmm. Chris, so thinking about how you maintain engagement, I think is an interesting and important question. Chris, anything you want to say on any of those points?
No, I mean, reiterate on the access point and agree with Juan on public-private partnerships, although I think another big part of Carry Digital's businesses unrelated to SMEs is on space and satellite technology. And I think we're on the cusp of a satellite connectivity boom that will mirror some of the impact that the mobile boom of 15, 20 years ago had on developing markets. You know, we're a way away from affordability being something that meets the needs of low-income users, but in terms of coverage, it's astonishing. So I think you know, coverage is something we can solve, but we need to work together better to make sure that we can get those prices down. But we'll just reiterate and point people actually to the chat. Nicholas Federici, who wrote a brilliant report on small business and enterprise capabilities for the ILO recently, has just posted a link in there. But picking up on what Juan said, you know, there is this real kind of hierarchy of capabilities, and that the developers, they come online, that kind of people need to be taken through, which is again why we're focusing a lot on our program, on making sure that we're teaching those people as they're doing activities so that they get the right kind of learning at the right time in their journey as they come to digitize their business. And that WhatsApp example was really key as well. We're looking in our program at micro-mentoring as one of the things that we offer, because often, you know, again, watching a video or reading a document isn't necessarily where you're going to learn the best. You know, you're going to learn best from someone else. You're going to learn best from someone who can teach you more broadly how digitizing your business can improve what you're doing and can be more responsive to what your specific requests are. So the other great thing that this technology offers us is that amazing opportunity for peer-to-peer learning and micro-mentoring, which is great.
Barbara, I know this is something you've been thinking a lot about.
Yeah, I mean, for us, utilization is critical because when we secure adoption, it's a cost to the fintech. When we guarantee usage, it's a revenue, income to the fintech. And so we really strive in that direction and have struggled a lot with it. It's not the easy piece of this. Adoption is easier. And there's so many reasons. And I think that's the part that has led us to consider this like omni-channel model. So yes, WhatsApp, but like inbound, outbound, kind of omni-channel engagement with customers as much as you can, because there are different kinds of customers and different kinds of problems. And each one is going to require kind of a different solution. So it's very common for a customer in a password enabled space to forget their password, try something, not succeed at the first attempt and just drop it and move on to their regular way of doing business, which might be a pen and paper or cash. And they're not going to necessarily let you know they did that and that happened. And so you need some outbound kind of reminders and check-ins in order to make sure that, hey, are you using this? Why not? Oh, you forgot your password. Here, try it, walk you through it and kind of get you to that place. There may be other situations where they're going to call you and you need a really good inbound service that can be chat enabled, or it can be phone, where you walk them through the solution because they're calling you. We find that the outbound tends to be that need tends to be more prevalent than the inbound. There's sort of a small group of users who are super excited, super engaged, and every time they have a problem, they'll reach out and try and call you and figure things out. But then there's also a lot of people who just give up and drop it and move on. And those are the ones we really don't want to lose. And that requires kind of a sophisticated technology and systems and operations, as well as costly systems and operations to make sure that you're serving them on an ongoing basis. So that's kind of what we've learned and are implementing, not ideally still, but going in the direction of ideally.
I will just say I'm highly familiar with the password challenge, how that plays out. One of the other issues I wanted we're just about at the end time. I know we still have some folks with us, so we may run a little long if our speakers can stay. But one of the things I wanted to talk about a little bit is that we've talked some today about the dynamic of having very small firms interact with very large platforms. And we've mentioned WhatsApp, and we've mentioned the platforms like Uber Eats, and this is a really relevant issue. A lot of organizations are working with WhatsApp, which is a really useful tool, but it also went down last week and had some really profound implications. So I would love to hear about what else we think we need to do on this issue, and who are the other players that need to come in to be part of making sure that we're that we're not just putting these very small firms at the mercy of very large platforms. Chris, I know this is something you will want to get at, and then I'll let Barbara and Juan in.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, the social media outages, when it was reported a couple of weeks ago, kind of initially kicked off in reporting in lots of newspapers about the kind of comedy aspect of people not being able to post pictures of their breakfast anymore. But very swiftly, we got some great reporting on the fact that actually for many people in India, that meant for 6 hours they can run their businesses. So I think we need to understand where we have these firms that are in the mode of shifting from attention economy in developed markets to transactional economies in emerging markets. How well are they managing that transition, and what can be there to support them, and how can we make sure that the ecosystem that we're building digital economies on is robust and strong? And I think that's a really fundamental thing in helping people understand how they use platforms in sensible ways, but also how they understand where those platforms are beneficial and where potential kind of pitfalls and problems are. But I think fundamentally, post-COVID, globally, we've seen 6 years of digital transformation in about 6 months.
Yeah.
And people haven't often digitized their business practices out of choice. They've done it out of absolute necessity. My wife is an artist. She teaches art. She moved from teaching it in dusty village halls to Zoom calls, and has had to completely reinvent the way that she works. And so within our program, when we're looking at kind of digitization, we're not just seeing it as something that is crossing the digital divide in emerging markets, but is actually something globally that everyone is having to deal with at a phenomenal rate of acceleration. And I think the thing we really need to do is make sure that there are solid structures in countries to support people. We referred to the inability without an email to register yourself or develop an ID. So, how do national systems enable people to establish trusted identities within transactional platforms that then builds a solid foundation for these new digital economies to exist? But then how will we, within our program and many other organizations, just help those organizations navigate their first few experiences with new digital platforms and new digital ways of working in a way that actually gets them to want to do more and explore more and improve their businesses for the better, rather than, having an immediate negative experience? Because everyone is digital now, whether you want to be or not. Fundamentally, we are in a situation where people's businesses are digitizing, as I say, out of necessity, not choice. So we need to be there to be able to help and support people through that.
Juan first, and then Barbara. A few quick thoughts on this. I'm going to try to wrap this up, but would love to hear your quick thoughts on this.
Yes, I think that there is a lot going on beyond the relationship between small MSMEs and the large players. Here in Mexico, within the fintech, been seeing fantastic and very positive partnerships between fintechs that perhaps are not in the field as other players, but who know that and who have therefore tried to make partnership, for example, with rural non-bank financial intermediaries who are supposed to know their clientele much better, so as to provide, for example, fintech as a services in rural areas. Led to very, very interesting piloting and fine-tuning of potential business models that I'm sure within the next few years are going to be observed with more and more cases in the region. This, I think, is something that is going on and that, perhaps was adopted at a faster pace with COVID, but this is something that is very exciting and that somehow gives us some solace in terms of thinking about these big players and the tiny ones. So I think there's going to be a lot of innovation in that regard. And I think that ultimately it is about having these partnerships go forth in terms of having clarity in the digital journey of MSMEs. So where are the opportunities to communicate with the MSMEs and to keep this level of trust once there was an adoption that happened, right? So it is really a process that has many different steps. But to the extent that the different stakeholders involved in these innovative partnerships, I think that there is a lot that can be done that I'm sure is going to be very exciting, and I'm sure is going to trigger higher levels of use after adoption.
Thank you. Barbara?
I might sort of frame this a little bit differently. And when I think about small businesses or low-income households in the developing world, business interruption is not a foreign concept, whether it's because of an outage, flood, an illness. I mean, there are millions of things that happen. And now we've added a new one, by being included in a digital world, there is now a new risk that will be very difficult to completely eliminate. And so I would also consider mitigation as kind of a strategy toward that, where you're not necessarily trying to solve, Facebook's problems, although that would be great. But also thinking about the way we mitigate risks of climate, the way we mitigate health risks for small businesses and give them some resilience through other financial products and services that help kind of manage that. And those could be financial products and services, but actually also, other strategies. So, other communication strategies and other commercialization strategies. So, maybe we're just kind of in a new world with that has added new risks and things to think about as we think about resilience.
Thank you. We're about at time for folks to go to the next part of the session. So want to thank folks. Want to thank everyone who joined us for this session today. A really great conversation in the chat, as well as the conversation that you're hearing on screen. So thanks to everyone for engaging in that. It's been great having you. Thanks to Barbara, Chris, Juan, and Tim for all the work that you do and for being with us today. It's been a great conversation. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
you.